Welcome to the meeting. As I said, we'll get going, and I'll continue to admit people as they get online. We're really excited to be collaborating with the team at the Mekong Club, Matt and Clemence and the rest of the team, to have this conversation today about how we may work together to address the need and the challenges for greater access to worker helplines in Asia. My name is Carmel Giblin, and I am the CEO at the ICTI Care Foundation. I'll come back in a moment and talk a little more about who we are, but I'd like to hand over, if I may, to Matt Friedman from the Mekong Club and ask him to share a few words to set the meeting up and get us going. Over to you, Matt. And Aoife, if you move on to the next slide.
Okay, well, welcome those of you who are in the room and those of you who are online. My name is Matt Friedman. I'm the CEO of the Mekong Club. I've been working in the space of addressing the issue of modern slavery, forced labor, human trafficking for about 11 years in the private sector, another 25 years before that in the public sector. And the interesting thing for me is that you see certain trends that develop over time. The whole concept of grievance mechanism has been very much part of my journey from the beginning. But 6 years ago, we weren't having many talks related to this. It was kind of something that would come up now and then, but we see that there's a certain amount of momentum that has happened over time. One is the general transparency legislation like Australia and the UK, but more relevant is the German one that basically says if you are going to be doing business and you have supply chains, you have to have grievance mechanisms. The EU legislation that we'll be seeing coming out will have something quite similar. And so we see this momentum moving in the direction of organizations feeling like they have to have something in place. Now, if you're a large organization, you can either do it yourself. We know organizations that do that. They have hotlines, they have apps and so forth. Or you can hire a service providing organization to do that. But if you're an SME, a smaller organization, and you don't really have the mechanism to do that, then you're kind of trying to figure out, well, where do you fit into the world? How do you go about doing this? How do you have that mandate in place and so forth? And so I think what you're going to see is a lot of innovation and a lot of standardization and a lot of discussion to try to make sense of kind of what is a helpline or a hotline or an app, and how do they all fit together, and how do we move forward? So I'm just going to spend another 5 minutes talking about an experience that I had that helped me as a practitioner to understand the relevance and the importance of moving away from 1,000 blossoming roses of interventions to moving more in the direction of standardizing and perhaps linking different mechanisms together. First slide.
Next one. Please.
Okay, so this happens to be in the public sector. I worked in the United States related to hotlines related to human trafficking. This would not be for the private sector. It would be for individuals who are in the real world who potentially find themselves in trouble, or individuals who see a person who might be in trouble. And so all across the United States, you had these hotlines, these helplines, these various things. Next slide. But there was kind of a difficulty associated with it. Most often, they were in a geographical location that was quite small, maybe a city, maybe a portion of a state within the United States. And so they didn't have very good coverage. Many of the people that they would have to go to, let's say that a victim called and said, I'm in trouble, and then they went back to that community to talk to the police and so forth, had no idea what human trafficking was. And as a result of that situation, they didn't know what to do when the call came in. So without that understanding of how do you react to a human trafficking case, oftentimes the case went cold and nothing happened. And so they didn't have access to knowing who are the NGOs in the community, who are the police that you go to, where are the shelters, and as a result of that, the system never really came together. Those hotlines also collected data, but only for the people who called. And so there was very little in the way of being able to benefit from patterns that existed and how things worked and so forth. And so these hotlines were very reactive. Somebody made a call and they did what they could to try to help the person. Sometimes it worked, oftentimes it didn't. Not proactive, where you look at what the data says, you develop a sense of what the trends are, and then you plan accordingly. And they weren't very cost effective because you had a single unit for whether you have one unit or another unit, that's 2 units that have administration and offices and so forth. So, you know, you had a lot of money going into these small, delicious little projects. Next slide. So as a result of this, you know, about 15 years ago, the US government said, let's invest in a national hotline. And so let's have that hotline be in Washington, DC. So they hired an organization called Polaris. And initially, Polaris was 3 people in a room with basically phones in front of them, and they were waiting for people to call and so forth. Now it's like something like 50 people, and they collect all kinds of information, and it happens all over the country. And there's a national hotline, and there's an app, and there's text messaging, and everything else linked up into one mechanism. Next. So what this allows for is, as a call comes in, let's say that a call comes in from a victim from Kansas City. It's a 1-800 number, it's toll free. That person says, I'm in a hotel, I'm in trouble. Immediately, what this hotline would do is to call the local police. The local police never dealt with something. So they train them on site. They say, okay, this is what you need to do. This is how you would, and then they contact the NGOs in the area. They bring the entire community together. And as a result of that, the activity takes place. That can't be done with local hotlines, but you can do it with a national one because you have these resources and so forth. So they are developing the experience and the capacity on site immediately. They then collect all the information on what happened with the case, who is the person, what happened to them, did they get rescued, all of this other stuff. That all goes into a data repository. They get literally thousands of cases a year. And as a result of that, they're able to analyze the data. And instead of it being reactive, just coming in, they can predict where they think there are going to be issues and problems associated with it. As a result of that, they can then take this information and go back to law enforcement, go back to the NGOs, go back to the shelters and train them on this particular process. And because it's centralized, it results in a certain amount of cost effectiveness. So a certain percentage of those hotlines still exist, and that's fine, but they've all linked up. Next slide. So you have the main hotline, but actually there's more than the 4 that you have. There may be like 16, 20, 25 hotlines. They're still there, but they serve a different purpose, but they all work collectively as a unit in essence to be able to develop this network. I have worked with probably 2,000 or 3,000 NGOs. This is, to me, the best NGO in the world on addressing human trafficking because they have so many bells and whistles and components that lead to an effective response. So for me, when I think about hotlines for grievance mechanisms and so forth, I immediately go to the lessons that I learned from this. It's a little bit different, but it's the same in terms of finding cost-effective ways of being able to consolidate and bring together, you know, different platforms. And we're not saying there has to be just one. There are other organizations that have hotlines and helplines on this call. But the idea is, can we create a mosaic that covers, you know, the factories, the suppliers, the SMEs, the various organizations in multiple languages that allows us to consolidate the data. Next slide. That would allow us to be able to make a difference. That would allow for the response to be tailored to the needs of the brands. I feel it would be cost effective, especially for the smaller organizations that don't have much of a budget to address this. It would allow for more of a collective response and community response where organizations are coming together. Collaboration would be among organizations that want to collaborate, and each of the helplines or apps have different components that can become very complementary. The best outcome for the brands and, more importantly, for the workers that may find themselves in this situation, something that people can tap into so that we're not reinventing the wheel. So the Mekong Club's desire to have conversations like this is to enter into the space with partners and other organizations to say, we think that if we consider this as an option as a community, not as individual organizations, but as community, perhaps this will make it easier for everybody and have a more efficient, effective approach. That's what I wanted to say. Thank you very much.
That's great, Matt. Thank you. Thank you so much for that. I think there's some really interesting, well, the Polaris example, definitely, but the benefits of that sort of collaborative model, I think, were really well captured in your words. And as we go through my presentation, or I guess the format of what I intend to do now is I've got some slides from the ICTI Care Foundation that I'll talk us through. But then we've got actually time for some discussion, and hopefully between Matt and ourselves, we'll be able to coordinate this quite large group into actually getting to some next steps and some firm actions about how we move forward. Like Matt said, the ICTI Care Foundation provides a helpline, but there are others that do this as well. And I think the spark that Matt has kind of lit about maybe collaborating across could really get us to an exciting solution. So let me start first of all by introducing us ourselves. As I said a minute ago, everyone's on mute because it's such a large group. But as I go through the presentation, please think of any questions that come to mind. And when we open up for wider discussion towards the end of our time together this morning, then I'll take everyone off mute so we can have a good conversation. But who is the ICTI Care Foundation? So we were established in 2004, and the program that you will know us for is the ICTI Ethical Toy Program. We're one of the leading ESG programs for working with a range of companies. We were actually created by the toy industry back, I think they first started having conversations in 1995 about the need for a code of business practices and then a need to provide assurance for compliance against that code. So we've really been focusing on the toy industry for the majority of our operational time. But in the last, I'd say 3 to 5 years, that model has been changing. And the factories and the companies that we work with are a much more diverse range. So from multiple categories, food and beverage, apparel, footwear, electronics, many, many more. So we will actually, in the next few months, you'll see our program name changing and evolving to make us a more accessible organization. So we will still be very passionate about the toy industry, but we will be changing the name to make us a more accessible program for all the brands and factories that we work with. So we've been operating for nearly 2 decades now. We're a not-for-profit organization, and that's really important to us because we operate with a mission, and our mission really is to help the companies that we work with achieve their ESG objectives, but importantly, ensure that the rights of workers are respected, and actually to go beyond just respecting the rights of workers, but seek opportunities from all the dollars that are spent through compliance initiatives, seek the opportunities to actually make a real impact for workers, and be a, for them working in companies and in supply chains, be a positive thing for them and their families and their communities. So that's really important to us. Our program is also developed, so whether it's our certification program for audits, whether it's our social impact assessment program, our environmental program, or the helpline, we work in a collaborative way around that as well. So everything we do is advised and guided by our technical advisory council and also our governing board. We work with most of the retailers globally, and that's really important from a point of view of kind of scale and ensuring that we address duplication, reduce costs, etc. And like I said, we do more than audit. We want to really create sustainable improvements that aren't the kind of traditional audit, find an issue, fix an issue, find an issue, fix an issue, but really take data and insights directly from workers, from factory owners, from brands, to really change the dial on some of the issues that we see related to labour standards. Next slide. So Matt touched on this, but from our perspective, why is a helpline needed? Most importantly, it gives workers an opportunity to get support when they need it. There are, as Matt alluded to as well, there are lots of companies who already offer a helpline for workers. There is actually a requirement in our program, for example, that there is some form of communication system within the factory already there. But what we do know is that workers really trust the independence of our helpline and the way that it operates. And I'll talk about the way that we operate a bit later on. But importantly, the helpline is needed to give workers an alternative route to their direct employer when needed to seek support when on issues that they may be experiencing. It's also really important that it helps management understand and respond to the needs of the workers. When we first launched the helpline, factory managers and factory owners were a little nervous about the helpline launching, and would that open the floodgates to workers? Would it create issues in the workplace? Actually, it's been the reverse. We do regular conversations with factory managers to understand their view on the helpline, and they actually find it really useful because it's giving them insights that they don't normally get, and it's helping address issues before they become really serious. So it's really helping to build harmony in the workplace, increase communication, and inform kind of training and capability building initiatives. It's also now becoming more and more of a requirement in order to comply with regulation. So you'll see on the screen a range of new or existing regulation that is really putting the need for helplines at the very forefront of corporates. And now companies are looking to how can they actively and effectively and cost effectively meet this requirement. And obviously there is always customers and consumers' expectations. So we're mindful of that and ensuring that, you know, their expectations of your customers, which you fought hard to secure, are met. Next slide. So we started the helpline in China originally in 2010. So I think it's really important. We have a really strong license to operate in mainland China. We've been operating there for 13 years now. We expanded the helpline in 2021 to Vietnam. And we have a commitment to keep expanding the country presence as needed. Obviously, we're a relatively small organization, but our impact is way beyond kind of our size. And I hope through conversations like this and further collaboration that we're really able to scale the helpline to ensure that it is accessible where it's needed globally, or that we collaborate with other partners to have the same effect. The helpline is free, confidential. It is an effective grievance mechanism. We tend to use words when we describe it as like a communication bridge, an aid to manager-employer kind of relationships and harmony. But it is obviously about addressing grievances when they have them from workers. And the purpose of the helpline is to inform, educate, and empower workers. Some of the questions that they call us about are relatively simple, and I'll talk about the type of questions that we get. But often it's just about giving workers some insight and some guidance about how they can manage the issue themselves, and that resolves the situation quickly and to the workers' satisfaction. So that says, I think there's also, when we're talking about the calls that we receive to the helpline, they're not all work related, and it is actually proved to be really important to help workers with other issues that they may have, because that helps them with their general stress. It helps them with their ability to work effectively in their place of work. So like I say, we're a bridge, really a communication bridge between workers and factories. Next slide. So a little about our helpline specifically. Our helpline is completely staffed by our own in-house team, and 100% of cases that come to the helpline are closed. I think one of the things that's really important is for the helpline to be, for any helpline to be effective, for any grievance mechanism to be effective, workers have to really trust it, and they have to know that it exists. So for us, the implementation of the helpline is really critical. You can't just kind of put a box in a room or a number on a wall and hope people will call it. You really have to inform the workers and work with management to ensure that they really understand the helpline. So for us, every worker in a factory that is using our helpline receives a helpline card. And there's some examples on the slide here. We've got a helpline for China, which we deploy in factory environments. And below that, you'll see an example of a helpline card that we've deployed in Vietnam, where we're supporting construction workers. So again, this our helpline doesn't just support factory workers, and certainly not just toy factory workers. It is broader than that. And this is a good example of it supporting construction workers in Vietnam. All cases that come to the helpline are received by a human being. So whilst I don't dispute the value of technology, there is nothing more effective, I believe, than having someone at the end of a call that you can speak to. And that's been really important for us. So, and really important for the workers. I think there is definitely opportunities to consider how technology and humans can work together to drive efficiencies, to drive scale, accessibility, and accessibility. But it is really important to us that we have human beings answering the call. We do a lot of promotion with factories so that they understand it. The factory managers are supportive, and that they promote it actively within their businesses. Next slide. So just some of the benefits. You will probably all be aware of these kind of benefits, or these will be your expectations, certainly, of benefits if you're not yet working with our helpline or utilizing other helplines. We split them across brands, factories, and workers. But if we concentrate just for a moment on the workers, it is about really helping them to understand their rights, ensure that they can access their rights, and they get the help that they needed in a really timely way, and that they have trust and confidence. But then if we look at brands and factories, there's obviously a regulatory aspect to this. But I think a really important point that Matt raised in the beginning is that the data really helps inform training and capability building. It changes you from being reactive to cases to being able to be proactive to cases. And if we think about the ethical toy program as an example, the cases that come to our helpline will inform the kind of training and capability building that we make available to all the factories in our program. So as a result of insights that we've received from the helpline, we've developed gender equality programs. We've developed training programs for supervisors in the workplace to help with supervisory skills. We've helped with childcare and issues around that through our family-friendly factory programs. So it really helps change the dial from being reactive to proactive. And I think that's really, really important. Also, I think what's important is sometimes workers have misunderstood their obligations in the workplace as well. So it helps us reduce tension when we're able to share with the worker what a process may be. So for example, if they've resigned from their employment, but they don't feel that they've, they wanted their final wages on the same day they resigned, they haven't given any notice period, etc. We help them to understand that there is a process that they should follow and what that process is. And that's really helpful for the factory managers in reducing that tension and providing clarity to the worker, clarity that they trust also. Next slide. I know there was quite a lot of words on that slide. We'll share this presentation afterwards, and it's a similar presentation you would have received in the mailing that we sent out. So you will have access to it to refer back to afterwards. We've pulled some data just for the factories in the ethical toy program. So this information just relates to this example. So you'll see that on average, the ethical toy program related calls are about 1,600 per year, or cases per year. Now, because we commit to 100% close every case that comes to us, a case may require multiple calls and emails backwards and forwards. So that 1,600 cases can actually relate to, maybe 10,000 calls over the same period. But they're pretty kind of steady. And we'll see also, I'll show you in a moment some analytics from our system, but you can also see when trends happen within the calls to the helpline. So for the toy industry, for example, which has historically been quite seasonally driven, with peak production being in the main summer months, kind of from after Easter till end of August, early September, you would see helpline calls increase during that period often, because that's when you have more workers in place. There's bigger concerns around temporary workers, the recruitment of workers, etc. So those calls often will escalate at different times. And that is a great indication of how you can become proactive. Because if you know that coming up to a high recruitment period for your factories and your suppliers, to get ahead of that by giving them some training about responsible recruitment, the use of labor brokers, the requirements around, no fees for a job, etc. You can give all that training in advance, which should hopefully reduce the instance of issues related, for example, to forced labor occurring. Next slide. So if you put all these up, these are the top reasons that we've had calls to the helpline. What's really important, I think, to call out in this, because often people are really fearful, especially now. They know there is a regulatory expectation to have a helpline, but they're kind of worried that they will be flooded with calls and cases that they cannot respond to. And I think that's an understandable concern. And it's really important that the right process is in place to deal with calls and respond to them in order to maintain trust and the effectiveness of the helpline. But I would stress that in our experience, only about 10% of the helpline cases are actually of the most egregious nature. So only about 10% relate normally to some sort of non-compliance against an established labour standard. The ethical toy programs standards and expectations are based on the ILO conventions, as many other kind of compliance programs would be. So when we're talking about issues that have to actually be investigated and remedied, they fall into these areas that you see on the screen. But that is a relatively small proportion of the helpline. And that's why the helpline is so effective in actually reducing misinterpretation or supporting workers in other areas where they may have concerns. That helps to create a positive working environment. Next slide. So we've just got a couple of case studies to show you how the helpline can actually work in action. So this example is related to child labour, underage workers. So we had a young worker call the helpline and they had questions about their salary. That's quite a normal question that we'll get. How's my salary being calculated? I don't understand it. I seem to be missing money, or money seems to have been withheld. So the helpline team, like I say, they're human beings. They are trained to ask questions that delve into the caller's, kind of root cause of maybe the problem or their situation. And from the conversation that our team member had with this person who was calling, it became clear that they were an underage worker, that they were 15. In this case, where we have a direct relationship with the factory, any issue that's related to a non-compliance, and certainly, the most serious non-compliances, we would send our colleagues from our program monitoring team to go to the factory. And they would go there unannounced, very, very quickly, and investigate the situation. In this case, we were able to identify more underage child workers, and then our remediation program kicks in. So those underage workers were taken from the factory, supported. We have a remediation program for then that factory, so that they go through a program of building their capability to ensure that this issue doesn't reoccur. So that's the really important thing. It's about finding an issue and then not just terminating a factory or stopping working with them, because that doesn't help build capability in the long term, but actually putting the effective remediation in place. And I think Matt talked about this in the example of Polaris, and the fact that you need to be able to take action locally when an issue is found. It's really important that the speed of your response and the completeness of your response satisfies the workers, but also helps the factory not make that issue again. And if the factory isn't prepared to take on the remediation and take the support and advice that's given to help them, then they shouldn't really be in any program. So from an ethical toy program perspective, if a factory is not prepared to enter a remediation program and make the necessary improvements, we would suspect, we would terminate them from our program. And we think that's really important, but it's our last, but it's ours, and it should for everyone be the last kind of decision that you make, really, and last resort. Next slide is, I think, another case study. So this is an example. There's many indicators of forced labor, and this is one that talks about the withholding of money from a worker. So we received a call from a worker. They'd been there for a little while. They wanted to resign, but the agency that had actually placed them there were saying that they were going to deduct money from their final salary. Often that will then, that could be a significant part of their actual salary. So it's not $200 may seem relatively small, but it's not in many cases. So that could mean that worker stays in the factory. They feel that they can't leave. So again, we informed the caller as to that should not happen. That's not allowed. It's not acceptable. And we then contacted the factory to talk to them and make sure that they understood that this shouldn't be happening. They went back and worked with the labor broker, and the salary was not deducted from that worker, and the worker resigned as they wanted to at the time they wanted to. So these are, and they're just, fairly straightforward examples, but they're really good examples. And this would have again informed us to work with that factory around responsible recruitment processes and helping them identify good labor brokers that they work with. We often talk about labor brokers in quite a negative way, but working with responsible labor brokers is a really good thing. But you need to, as a factory, you need the support to ask the right questions so that you know you're working with the right labor brokers. So these kind of insights really help that conversation. Next slide. So I'll just quickly go to the next slide, which just shows you how we work currently. So we receive a call that's answered by a member of the helpline team, and it could be a straightforward call. We generally talk about calls coming in 3 types. So the first type being where there is a serious non-compliance, where there is some breach of labor standards that we would investigate. There can be another call which is relatively easy to manage, and it might be of a more a kind of a process or a policy or something that the worker hasn't understood. So the factory isn't doing anything wrong, but maybe the worker hasn't understood how their wages have been calculated. So we help them understand and answer that question. We would still give advices back to the factory about, you need to ensure that your workers understand how their wages are calculated. So we would still provide that feedback, but it's a case that can be closed quite quickly. And then we have about 1/3 of our cases are nothing related to the factory's responsibilities at all. We have workers calling to say they need to open a bank account. They don't know how to. They need to register with a doctor. They're feeling lonely and isolated because they've migrated for work. They don't know how to make friends. Lots of different reasons, but all go to supporting their positive mental health by having an avenue that they can talk to. So the consultancy call email is relatively short, as in it's a short process. We speak with the workers. I had an example the other day where we had a construction worker call the site, call the helpline, and they were just desperately sad and lonely. And our person spoke to them for an hour and a half, and they felt much better for it. But and that's the bit about it being human beings answering and managing calls. So that's when it's relatively straightforward. If there is a complaint related to labour standards or concern related to labour standards, then we'll put it into different areas. So where there's evidence, we can go through and verify that. So either our helpline staff will work with the factories and the workers to resolve the case remotely, so depending on the nature of it, or if it's a more urgent or serious, then we will dispatch our investigation team to resolve the case. And we keep going through and keep talking to the workers until they are happy that the case has been resolved to their satisfaction. And that really has built trust with workers who use it, but it's also provided the workers who've used the helpline, they are our greatest advocates. So even when we've had workers move to factories that aren't in our program, aren't supported by our helpline, they will tell their colleagues to call us because we'll be able to help them and give them advice. And that's something I'm really proud of, that we have built such a high level of trust. Next slide. This is just an example of, we have a system called Connect Analytics. This is just an example of some of the data that can be taken from that system. So for example, you can look at your own information of your own suppliers, but there's also benchmark information available as well. So you can compare, are you seeing the same issues that everyone else is in that particular region, that country, that sector of your supply chain, or is it something that's unique to you? And is it all your factories are experiencing it, all your suppliers are experiencing the same challenge and the same issue, or is it one? And that really helps you and us build responses that can turn us to being proactive rather than reactive. So this is just a bit of a snapshot, but to give you some indication of the kind of data that is available through reporting analytics. Next slide. What we also do, so anyone who uses our helpline has access to the Connect system that I just showed you, but we also provide on-request call logs for companies. So if they want reporting in a different way, this is a really simple example, but it just shows you the kind of template that we use. So we logged a question from the worker related to them just wanting to apply for a bank card. This was what our response was, and the case was closed. So the worker confirmed that they had enough information now to do what they wanted to do. And that's just sent to companies that use the helpline, in addition, if they want to, from the Connect Analytics. Right, well, I'll do my closing bit, and maybe Matt, I'll hand to you for the final words to send us on our way. But for me, like I say, really pleased that we had so many people join the call today. It is difficult when it's a mixture of hybrid and in person, so I hope it's delivered the insights and the value that of conversation that you were hoping for. It's certainly been encouraging to me to have so many people participate in this conversation. So in terms of next steps, we'll send an email to everyone who registered, answering all the questions that were posed with a bit more insights, some suggested next steps. And for those of you who would like to move forward and go to the next stage of kind of working into some of the actual detail about what is the need, what is the scope, how could we respond to that, all the questions on process, cost, etc., then we'd love you to be part of that. So you can let us know, and then we'll move to set up the next rounds of meetings. So thank you for attending. Really appreciate your support and your commitment to providing a voice for workers. Matt, maybe you've got a few closing words.
Yeah, just wanted to add something, Carmel, and to answer one of the questions on mapping of existing solutions. Actually, we started mapping some of the service providers, the type of services and solutions that they are offering, the technology or human resources involved, and the country of implementation. It's a work in progress. So if you're interested in this work as part of this project, we invite you to reach out to us. And this is a way for us to identify potential synergies. And as there might be some information missing, we welcome you to contribute to that as well.
That's brilliant. And that work that you've already got in progress is a great start. So maybe the working group that we put together can kind of build on that as well. But it's a great way to start us off. Thanks, Clemence.
Well, thank you, Kamal. Very informative presentation. Thank you all for participating in this. I go back to the Polaris example where, you know, I've been focusing on addressing forced labor for 32 years now, and you've seen lots of starts and stops and things that have worked and not worked and so forth. In the case of Polaris, I remember when they said, let's have a national hotline, they said it couldn't be done. There were a lot of naysayers. Everybody was saying, you know, it's impossible, et cetera. They had a couple of people answering the line. And as I said, they went from that to something much more comprehensive that actually does achieve things. It does collect the data. It's cost effective. It allows us to be proactive. All the things that we wanted to have happen, happened. So I'm hoping that, you know, maybe 2 years from now, we're sitting in a room like this, looking back at the day that we had this initial talk in order to get this started. And as a result of the feedback, as a result of the commitment, as a result of the frequently asked questions, as a result of a number of organizations stepping up and saying, let's do this, let's make it happen. We look back and say, well, remember that meeting? Look at where we are now. We have this mosaic of different groups that are coming together using, you know, both the helpline in person along with the apps and at different levels, and the organizations are kind of tapping into it. And Asia is then the best practice for the rest of the world, where people say, okay, well, if Asia can do it, then we can do this in other locations. We have a lot of different languages here. We have a lot of different levels of factories and so forth. There's a lot of complexity associated with this. But when I stop and look out the window here, the complexity of what goes into a city and what goes into, you know, getting the water there and the electricity and the streets and the streetlights and all the infrastructure. If that can happen, we can take something like this and make it into a reality so that the brands are protected, the suppliers are protected, and most importantly, the employees are protected. With that, you know, I just hope we can kind of take on this responsibility. The Mekong Club will take whatever role you guys want us to take in this. We are not the service provider in this case. We see ourselves as more of the convener, bringing the groups together, and the cheerleader and the encouragers. And if you need additional data and information, we'll get our teams of interns and consultants and so forth on it. But let's have that conversation 2 years from now when we look back and say, you know, we feel proud of what we were able to do, and it turned out to be something really important and effective. With that, thank you very much.
Thank you, Matt. Those are great, inspiring words to finish today's meeting. Thanks again to everyone for your time. We'll be in touch really soon. And like Matt said, I hope we can look back on this moment with real pride in a couple of years about what we started today. So thank you.